What are some of the best-known arguments concluding that artificial intelligence cannot think and understand? What are their strengths and weaknesses, and do any of them settle the question? Hello everybody, I'm Michael Augros. I teach at Aquinas College and my field is philosophy. Welcome to this 6th video in a 10-video series dedicated to the question whether an artificial intelligence can truly think and understand. In the last 2 videos, we looked at 10 arguments advanced by others attempting to show that AI systems really do think and understand. Upon being evaluated, every one of those arguments revealed a fatal flaw or 2. In this video, we're going to look at arguments on the other side, attempting to show that AI systems really do not think or understand anything at all. Some of these are just commonly made arguments not attributed to any one particular thinker, while others are credited to a definite philosopher such as Leibniz or John Searle. Some of them are pretty weak, others are quite strong, and some of the strong ones apply only to some types of AI, while others are more general. After explaining each argument, I'll offer my assessment of its strength. The first type of argument is one that's commonly made, and credit for it isn't given to any particular philosopher, although Alan Turing himself drew attention to it and critiqued it. He called arguments of this type arguments from various disabilities. What's common to them is that they find something that an artificial intelligence cannot do, but which a truly intelligent being should be able to do, and conclude that artificial intelligence is not truly intelligent. In the past, someone might have made this argument, for example. What can truly think and understand can write an original poem. An artificial intelligence cannot write an original poem. Therefore, an artificial intelligence cannot truly think and understand. Or someone might have said, what can truly think and understand can hold a conversation with you. An artificial intelligence cannot hold a conversation with you. Therefore, an artificial intelligence cannot truly think and understand. Or someone might have said, what can truly think and understand can detect humor and sarcasm. An artificial intelligence cannot do that. Therefore, an artificial intelligence cannot truly think and understand. LLMs have more or less rendered the second premises in these arguments unsustainable today. If you want AI to be able to do something that it currently can't do, just tell a room full of engineers and researchers that it can never be done, or don't even bother since they're already working on it. Now, we can still find disabilities, things that current models cannot do. For example, we could raise the bar a little bit and observe that LLMs are not very good at inventing truly funny things the way comedians can. Nor can they write novels or plays or poems with real depth. Then again, neither can most human beings, myself included. Most researchers still agree, as of now, July 2025, that AGI, artificial general intelligence, has not yet been achieved. That speaks to a certain disability of current AI. It lacks a certain generality that we think is a hallmark of true intelligence. And since generality seems to be a feature of true intelligence, the gap between current AI and AGI can be used to argue like this. Premise 1. What can truly think and understand has the ability to solve a wide range of cognitive problems by drawing inferences in all domains and adapting to novel tasks without external guidance. Premise 2. An artificial intelligence does not have such an ability. Therefore, an artificial intelligence cannot truly think and understand. The argument is good as far as it goes, but it does not really go very far. Premise 2 really means current artificial intelligence does not have such an ability. It does not tell us why AI in principle cannot have it, or provide some guarantee that it will never have it, or even that it won't have it by 2029. And as long as the argument leaves that an open possibility, it leaves the real question unanswered, which is whether natural intelligence and artificial intelligence differ necessarily and essentially, and if so, whether they differ only as 2 species of a genus, or as things contained in completely separate genera. To answer that sort of question, it's not enough to say what current AI is incapable of, it's necessary to show what AI is incapable of in principle, just as a consequence of its being AI. So that was the first argument, the argument from current disabilities of AI. The next argument is probably made more often by journalists than by philosophers, but there's something to it. We can call it the argument from hallucinations. An AI hallucination is an instance in which a model produces outputs that are not grounded in reality. For example, an AI image generator will sometimes produce an image that includes objects or features that do not exist in the real world. If you ask it to produce an image of people at the beach, for instance, it might give some of those people 3 legs. Or if you ask an LLM to produce a legal document, it might cite non-existent court cases, something for which attorneys have sometimes gotten in trouble. Certain mistakes made by LLMs can be understood as consequences of moral or political bias, or else inaccuracies, in the data on which the model was trained. For example, if a model is asked to generate an image of the American founding fathers signing the Declaration of Independence, and it produces an image of a room full of women signing it, that probably reflects what certain people have said about history and is not exactly the fault of the model. Or if a model returns an incorrect answer for the date of some historical event, that could be due to inaccuracies in the data itself. But giving people 3 legs and making up court cases, that type of mistake seems to reveal the model's utter lack of understanding, which is a consequence of the fact that it's not dealing with reality itself, but with patterns and connections that can be found in the data set on which it was trained. An LLM is not informed directly by reality itself, but is trained on data that are themselves representations of reality, language, images, code, and so on, which are always mediated, selective, and interpretive. So one could argue like this. Premise 1. What can truly think and understand is directly informed by reality itself. Premise 2, an LLM is not directly informed by reality itself, but by representations of reality that are at least one step removed from it. Therefore, an LLM cannot truly think and understand. A strength in this argument is that it draws attention to an important difference between LLMs and real intelligence. One weakness or limitation of the argument is that it's restricted to current LLMs and does not apply to AI universally. Suppose some sort of AI were embodied in a robot, and that the AI was not even trained on a data set, but simulated perception, concept formation, and reasoning in response to its direct physical interaction with the world. Such an AI would be taking in information from reality itself rather than from a data set. Whether such a thing is possible or not may remain to be seen, but if the question is whether AI differs in principle from true intelligence, this argument falls short of providing an answer. Another commonly made argument focuses on the way in which LLMs operate. As some have put it, an LLM is like a glorified version of the autocomplete feature we use when we send texts. True, an LLM functions at a vastly more complex and nuanced level, incorporating far more context and longer dependencies, but it relies on next token prediction. It works by generating one word or token in its output at a time. When you ask a large language model the question, "What is a rainbow?" the model processes this prompt as a sequence of tokens, which may be whole words or parts of words. The model doesn't think or search for facts in a database. Instead, it uses patterns it learned during training to predict and generate the most likely next token, one at a time. For example, to generate a response like, "A rainbow is a natural multicolored arc that appears in the sky when sunlight shines through raindrops, creating a visible spectrum of colors due to the refraction and reflection of light," the model would work roughly as follows. First, the full prompt, "What is a rainbow?" is tokenized and passed into the model. Second, the model processes that token sequence and predicts the most likely next token, in this case, the article A. Third, that token is added to the input sentence, forming "What is a rainbow? A." And the model predicts the next token, in this case, rainbow. The process continues token by token, predicting is, then A, then natural, and so on. At each step, the model is not reprocessing from scratch. Instead, it maintains an internal state via transformer layers that summarizes all the information seen so far. These states help it efficiently determine the next token without restarting the computation. The generation continues until a special stop token is predicted or the model hits its maximum token limit, which can result in a cutoff sentence. By contrast, if we are asked what a rainbow is and we happen to know, then in thinking out our answer, we might first realize we have to include arc or bow in the answer, since that's the more general category that a rainbow fits under. Next, we might realize we have to say something about the sky, since that's where rainbows exist. And then we might see that we have to include something about the sun and raindrops, since those are the causes of a rainbow. After some thought in which we gather up these key concepts that are more basic than and essential to the concept of a rainbow, we can think about how to articulate them in a sentence with proper English syntax. Our thinking is thus a top-down, goal-directed cognitive process, beginning with meaning and ideas, and only afterward working with words and syntax. That's not at all the sort of process that an LLM is carrying out. When generating text or engaging in conversation, an LLM does not begin by identifying or planning the key ideas it should include in its response. Unlike human thinkers, it doesn't reason through what concepts are relevant or what causal relationships are in play. Instead, the model produces responses one token at a time, using patterns it learned during training. These predictions are based not on real-time access to a data set, but on statistical associations encoded in the model's parameters. During training, the model was exposed to a vast collection of text drawn from books, websites, articles, and other sources. In this data, patterns emerged, not just patterns regarding which words appear, but regarding how they appear relative to each other. Which words tend to follow others, which commonly co-occur, which sequences are more likely than others. For instance, the phrase vast majority appears very frequently in natural language, and the model has learned this association. In contrast, the words gorilla and ergonomic rarely appear together, and even less so in that specific order. As a result, when generating text, the model is far more likely to predict the next token as majority after vast than to generate a phrase like gorilla ergonomic, which it has seen very little, if at all. True, the model does more than simply track which words tend to immediately follow others. Its underlying transformer architecture enables it to process and respond to patterns across the entire input sequence. This architecture assigns different levels of importance to all the different parts of the prompt in relation to all the others, allowing the model to generate responses that are often coherent and contextually appropriate. However, these operations do not involve understanding or reasoning. Instead, the model is performing a sequence of mathematical computations to estimate the most likely next token based on patterns it's encoded in its parameters during training. These patterns reflect the statistical structure of language found in its training data, rather than any grasp of meaning or intent. This process is fundamentally different from how human beings generate responses to questions. While a large language model generates text simply by analyzing and extending patterns in sequences of words or tokens, a person typically begins by interpreting the words in a question to form an internal understanding composed of meanings and ideas. After thinking in the medium of ideas, sometimes non-verbally, a person might come upon an idea of how to answer, and then go in search of the right words to express that answer. Like LLMs, people also draw unfamiliar patterns in language, but these do not constitute thought. Instead, they serve as tools to guide thought or express it, and sometimes they even act as barriers to thought. Well-worn phrases can help us think and communicate efficiently, but they can also discourage original thinking if we allow them to shape our thoughts automatically and thus prevent us from forming new ideas that might require unfamiliar or unexpected combinations of words. Now, a human mind is perhaps only an example of a true mind, that is, of a power that performs immanent operations of thinking and understanding. But the fact that it uses concepts primarily and words only in the service of concepts belongs to it as a mind, not merely as a human mind. Words themselves are not understandings of things, whereas any mind must deal primarily in understandings of things. Therefore, nothing that operates primarily on the basis of statistical patterns and associations of words and phrases, especially if it does not operate in the medium of concepts at all, is a true mind. We can sum this up in the following argument. Premise 1. Any true intelligence works primarily with concepts of things and uses statistical patterns and associations of words and phrases, if at all, only in the service of concepts. Premise 2. No LLM works primarily or at all with concepts of things, but only with statistical patterns and associations of words and phrases. Therefore, no LLM is a true intelligence. The argument is logically valid and basically sound, and a similar argument can be made on the basis of the peculiar way that many LLMs reply to mathematical questions. While they may appear to solve math problems, they do so not by executing formal mathematical algorithms, but by leveraging their core mechanism of next token prediction, generating plausible sequences based on patterns learned from text data. As a result, the work they do to answer mathematical questions is often a byproduct of language modeling rather than true computation. However, this limitation is increasingly being addressed through hybrid models that integrate LLMs with dedicated computational engines, enabling them to more accurately and reliably solve mathematical problems and thus better simulate what we ourselves do. Indeed, this whole line of argument is fairly particular. It's about LLMs, not about AI in general. Part of ongoing AI research is to build systems that do something more like what we human beings do when we form concepts and reason. Could research like that one day produce an AI system that does reason in concepts and that does use words only in their service and consequently is a true intelligence? The argument we're looking at now doesn't tell us. When we come to John Searle's argument, we'll see that it's similar to this one except that it's far more general. Since his argument considerably improves on this one, we can leave this one behind and give his more consideration when we come to it. Our next argument is not commonly made and originates from a particular eminent thinker, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. A German philosopher, logician, and mathematician, Leibniz is especially renowned, alongside Isaac Newton, for independently developing calculus in the West. He also contributed to the early development of mechanical calculators. Seeing as that contribution sheds some light on how AI came into existence, it may be worth a short digression before we come to Leibniz's argument. So here's a ridiculously brief history of the development of computers. Originally, the word computer referred to a person who performed calculations. Such human computers naturally sought tools to assist in their work. Over time, these tools themselves came to be called computers, initially because they supported human computation, and eventually because they themselves autonomously performed actions analogous to human computation. The history of such devices is long, fascinating, and illuminating. No doubt the first external aids to human computation were human fingers, the original digits from which our modern digital devices ultimately derive their name. Though fingers are used for counting to this day, their obvious limitations long ago sent human computers in search of more powerful assistance. An early example is the abacus. Fast forward some thousands of years and we come to the Gunter rule, a calculating device introduced in 1620 by Edmund Gunter of Oxford, not long after John Napier invented the notion of a logarithm. In 1622, William Oughtred of Cambridge combined two logarithmic scales and produced the slide rule, an analog computer reducing the problem of multiplying and dividing large numbers to addition and subtraction. Soon after that, in 1642, Blaise Pascal, another philosopher and mathematician, designed his mechanical calculator, or Pascaline, composed of metal dials. This device was capable of addition and subtraction directly and of limited multiplication via repeated additions. After 50 prototypes, Pascal made a version of his machine public in 1645. In 1672, Leibniz began inventing a similar machine, his stepped reckoner, which he had completed by 1694 and which was the first machine capable of all four fundamental arithmetical operations. In France in 1820, Charles Xavier Thomas de Colmar patented his arithmometer based on the same principles as Leibniz's machine, but more powerful and more reliable than any device that had preceded it. Most of the history of computers and AI has happened since then, of course, but you can see that in some sense Leibniz can be called an inventor of a type of computer. Really, his stepped reckoner was more of a calculator, limited to arithmetical operations, rather than a modern general-purpose computer capable of following arbitrary algorithms. Leibniz did entertain broader hopes for computation, however. He was a big believer in the possibility of formalizing all human thought. That is, he believed it possible to translate all human concepts into a formal system of symbols or characters, an alphabet of thought, if you will. With that alphabet established, it would be possible to reduce all reasoning and problem-solving to manipulation of symbols in accordance with rules of inference, much as algebraic problems are reduced to manipulation of algebraic symbols in accordance with rules of algebra. He even attempted to realize that dream in his first book, Dissertatio de Arte Combinatoria, Dissertation on the Art of Combination, published in Leipzig in 1666 when he was only 20. It was an expansion of his doctoral dissertation and was reissued in 1690 without his permission, which prompted him to express regrets about its circulation since he came to regard it as immature. In the centuries to follow, his project has been carried on by countless mathematical logicians and computer scientists who are still at work on it today. Now, how can Leibniz help us with our question about AI? In section 17 of his Monadology, he advanced a certain argument which, if correct, would answer our question in the negative. No possible AI could ever truly perceive, think, or understand. Here's the passage I have in mind. So this is Leibniz. It must be confessed, however, that perception and that which depends upon it are inexplicable by mechanical causes, that is to say, by figures and motions. Supposing that there were a machine whose structure produced thought, sensation, and perception, we could conceive of it as increased in size with the same proportions until one was able to enter into its interior, as he would into a mill. Now, on going into it, he would find only pieces working upon one another, but never would he find anything like perception. It's accordingly in the simple substance, and not in the composite one, nor in a machine, that perception is to be sought. Furthermore, there's nothing besides perceptions and their changes to be found in the simple substance, and it's in these alone that all the internal activities of the simple substance consists. This remarkable argument is still proposed and defended by some scholars and philosophers today. And Christoph Koch, an American cognitive scientist, neurophysiologist, and computational neuroscientist, quotes it with evident admiration, if not quite with approval, in his book Consciousness, Confessions of a Romantic Reductionist. A few terms in Leibniz's argument could do with some elaboration, namely substance, simple substance, composite substance, and machine. Although he didn't mention an aggregate in the passage I just quoted, it may be helpful to consider that notion of his as well. By a substance, he means any unified entity that's not a property of something else, but is just a being in its own right. Socrates, for example, is a substance, a substantial being, since he's not a property of anything else, but is just something in himself, and a possessor of properties. By contrast, his knowledge of geometry is not a substance, since it's just a property or a quality of him. And his love for his wife is also not a substance, since that's not a being in its own right either, but is just a disposition of him. By a simple substance or monad, Leibniz means a substantial being that's not composed of any parts, hence one that lacks any material components and is thus an incorporeal and indivisible substance. In some cases, such as human minds, a simple substance may be a spiritual being or rational soul, but not all simple substances are of that type. The souls of irrational animals would also be classed as simple substances in the philosophy of Leibniz. By a composite substance, he means a living being that has body and soul for components, one of which is corporeal and the other of which is simple and indivisible. Although not perfectly simple and indivisible, a composite substance has a substantial unity due to its including a dominant monad or simple substance, such as a human soul or an animal soul. By an aggregate, he means a collection or heap of monads, substances, a pile or heap of beings without any dominant monad included in it. What we normally think of as inanimate substances would all be aggregates, according to him. By a machine, Leibniz means any aggregate with parts arranged in some structure such that one part can act on another. According to these definitions, no AI system would be a substance, whether simple or composite, but would instead be an aggregate and a machine, whereas the human brain would be a part of a composite substance. With these preliminaries in place, we can now extract and evaluate Leibniz's argument. Premise 1. Perception, thought, and sensation are produced only within simple substances as internal acts that do not consist in one substance acting on another or in one part of a substance acting on another part. Premise 2. Machines are not simple substances, but aggregates of substances whose operations consist entirely in external interactions among parts. Therefore, no machine can produce perception, thought, or sensation. How should we assess this argument? Certainly its logic is sound. It could hardly fail to be coming from Leibniz. But what about the premises? Premise 1 seems to acknowledge that all cognitive acts, such as thinking and sensing, are what we called immanent operations back in video 3. To that extent, the premise is saying something true, and at any rate in agreement with Aquinas. Expressing this aspect of premise 1 in Thomistic terminology is not a distortion of Leibniz's thought, just a different way of saying much the same thing. In fact, Leibniz was to some degree an admirer of Aquinas and was in some measure indebted to him. Premise 2 is undeniable. Machines certainly are not simple substances in the sense that Leibniz has in mind. They're not indivisible entities without parts of any kind. Is the argument therefore decisive? Well, I think it isn't quite, although it strongly suggests that a modified version may well be decisive. What gives me pause is another aspect of premise 1 besides its correct insistence that cognitive action is immanent in nature. The other aspect I mean is its assertion that every cognitive act is the act of a simple substance, an indivisible being without parts of any kind. This implies that what we normally call an animal does not sense, imagine, or remember anything. Instead, its indivisible monad or irrational soul is what does all the sensing. Leibniz would say there's a sense in which we could attribute sensation to the animal as a whole, including its body, but it's not easy to see how that wouldn't end up being just some sort of figure of speech. It's at least counterintuitive. Likewise, the premise implies that no human cognitive act takes place in the human brain, which is very difficult to reconcile with the fact that the human brain is necessary for most, if not all, human cognitive acts. For just that reason, Aquinas and Aristotle held, contrary to Leibniz, that most cognitive acts are performed by the composite of body and soul, not by the soul alone. Moreover, despite its strengths, Leibniz's argument does not prove that an immanent operation is impossible for a brain to perform. True, the most obvious sorts of action in something like a brain are transitive actions among parts, and these cannot themselves be cognitive actions, which are instead immanent operations. But why couldn't these transitive acts of the brain produce or preserve a representation in the brain, which representation in turn is the basis of an immanent operation? In that case, that part of the brain would be performing both transitive operations preparatory for cognition, but also the immanent cognitive operation itself by means of the representation it received or else constructed within itself. If these misgivings and suspicions are well-founded, then Leibniz seems to make at least some of our cognition too spiritual, too incorporeal. To free it from that defect, the argument would have to be modified in such a way as to accommodate the fact that at least some cognitive actions can be performed by corporeal beings or organs. Is such an accommodation possible? Could it be, for instance, that a natural thing is capable of certain immanent operations, but no artificial thing, like an AI system, is so capable? If so, then something very close to Leibniz's argument could be decisive. To complete the argument, it would be necessary to discover some reason why natural living things can perform immanent operations while artificial things cannot. We'll return to that theme in video 9 with the help of Aquinas. Let's now turn to a fifth type of argument, one made by many people but given its sharpest edge, I think, by the German-born philosopher Hans Jonas, who lived from 1903 to 1993. Jonas, a one-time student, then critic of Martin Heidegger, devotes the fifth essay of The Phenomenon of Life, published in 1966, to what he sees as a dangerous intellectual shortcut, and it's from this essay that we can extract the fifth type of argument. The backdrop is cybernetics, the mid-century cross-disciplinary study of control and communication in machines, organisms, and even societies. Cybernetics is especially preoccupied with feedback loops, the thermostat sensing the room, the cell regulating its chemistry, the company navigating its way through a market. Because it ranges across engineering, biology, and sociology, it overlaps with, but is not the same as, modern artificial intelligence, which stays largely inside computer science and intelligence tasks. You won't hear about cybernetics as often as you hear about AI, which has in some sense upstaged it, but it's still active in certain circles. Jonas's worry is not cybernetics itself. He admires its technical accomplishments. What he resists is a philosophical leap that some enthusiasts make, namely the idea that if a feedback circuit can mimic goal-directed behavior, then teleology, the inherent purposiveness of living beings, must be nothing more than machinery in disguise. In the essay I mentioned, Jonas set out to critique the philosophical claim that cybernetics has made it possible to reduce teleology and inherent purpose to mechanical principles. In that essay, Jonas analyzes the case of a target-seeking torpedo, which is proposed by one author as an example of a purely mechanical thing that's intrinsically purposeful, as a thing that has a purpose of its own, in other words, and is not just serving one of our purposes. Because a machine like that can accomplish what we recognize as a goal and can do so without our manually guiding it, some thinkers are inclined to attribute to it real goal-seeking behavior, true purpose in the strict sense. Accordingly, the modern servo mechanism, observes Jonas, is described as perceptive, responsive, adaptive, purposive, retentive, learning, decision-making, intelligent, and correspondingly, men and human societies are being conceived of and explained as feedback mechanisms, communication systems, and computing machines. But Jonas doesn't think it makes any sense to regard machines as having intrinsic purposes of their own. He acknowledges that a target-seeking torpedo isn't physically drawn to its target the way a planet is to the sun, and that the influence exerted by its moving target is more like a message or a signal than a force steering it. Still, a clear distinction remains between what the torpedo does and anything genuinely acting with purpose. To act with one's own purpose is to desire a certain outcome and to adopt a course of action aimed at bringing about that desired end. But the torpedo, of course, doesn't desire the destruction of the target. Only its builders or operators harbor that intention. It therefore doesn't act with a purpose of its own, but rather in the service of theirs. Non-human animals, by contrast, clearly can have purposes of their own. They may not formulate plans and goals as we do, but they evidently experience desire and act in ways that satisfy it. Plants or the vegetative powers of animals are harder to interpret, but even there it seems fair to say they possess needs of their own. A plant may not consciously crave water, but it needs it in order to live. A torpedo, on the other hand, has no need for its target's destruction. What then does all this mean for our question about AI? Well, what we call thinking in ourselves seems to be an inherently goal-driven, purposeful act. When we're thinking about something, it's often with a view to some further action, and at least with a view to some understanding. It's thus for the sake of some end desired by the one who's thinking. And the verbal instruments of thought are truly such only in relation to a thinking being endowed with purposes of its own. Premises, for example, are not really premises unless they're introduced for the sake of reaching a conclusion, which implies a desire to reach a conclusion. A word is not really a word unless it's used for the sake of signifying things, which implies a need or a desire to signify them. Likewise, a definition is not really a definition except in relation to a need or desire for things to be defined. A statement is not really a statement except in relation to a need for things to be stated, and a proof is not really a proof except in relation to a need for things to be proved. So wherever we find no desires, no purposes, no goals, no needs, we also find no real instruments of thought and no real thinking. From this, we can mount an argument that bears directly on AI. Premise 1. Every genuine intelligence has desires, purposes, goals, and needs of its own. Premise 2. No AI system has desires, purposes, goals, or needs of its own. Therefore, no AI system is a genuine intelligence. To be clear, that's not an argument that Jonas himself put together, but it's based on and inspired by his critique of the philosophical claim that something like a target-seeking torpedo has inherent purpose. Does the argument hold up? Premise 1 is eminently reasonable given all the foregoing observations about how thinking is an inherently goal-driven act. Besides, what can really think and understand can grasp the concept of the good and the desirable, and can also grasp the concept of truth. And since the truth is the good of the understanding, it follows that whatever can think and understand can grasp its own good. So it would be strange if it could not also desire it. Premise 2 is the tougher one. It seems true enough that no current AI system has desires or goals of its own, but is it impossible in principle for an AI system to have goals and desires? If it is impossible, there must be some reason for that impossibility, and the argument, as I presented it, doesn't supply any. Jonas himself would no doubt be inclined to deny that any future AI could ever possess needs or desires of its own, and I would agree. But again, the argument as I presented it doesn't provide us with a reason why that should be so. Also, the argument may be proceeding a little bit in the reverse of the actual order of things. That wouldn't make it a bad argument, but it would mean it's not providing the cause of the truth of its conclusion, but arguing to it from something posterior to it in reality. The fact that current AI systems don't have real desires is arguably more evident to us than the fact that they don't have real thoughts and understanding, but their lacking real desires may not be more fundamental in reality than the fact that they don't have real cognition. At least, it seems possible to have cognition without there being any conscious desire for its object, as when I hear something, whether I wish to or not. Whereas it's impossible to experience conscious desire without some knowledge or awareness of its object. To that extent, cognitive acts seem to be prior to appetitive ones in the order of reality. So, if we're looking for a causal explanation of why AI cannot truly understand, we'll probably have to look deeper than this argument has taken us. We'll have to seek out the physical or natural prerequisites of cognitive power in general, and maybe the prerequisites of all imminent operation, and see why AI systems fail to meet them. We've looked at 5 arguments so far. Now we come to one of the most famous arguments offered for the conclusion that AI systems cannot really think or understand. I'm talking about the Chinese room argument of John Searle. Searle is an American analytic philosopher who began teaching at UC Berkeley in 1959 and became emeritus in 2014. He's noted especially for his contributions to the philosophy of language and the philosophy of mind, among other things. His Chinese room argument is leveled against a position he calls the strong AI hypothesis, which maintains that a suitably programmed computer, if, when it's given the right inputs, it produces the right outputs, would thereby possess a mind, not merely in a metaphorical sense, as a thermostat senses the temperature in the room, but in as true and literal a sense as that in which human beings have minds. Searle presents his case in the form of a thought experiment. The version I recount here departs from his original in only a few inconsequential details. Picture several native Chinese speakers sightseeing in New York when they stumble upon a windowless kiosk with a single door and a sign. All questions written in Chinese answered here. Beside the door are 2 narrow slots, one marked questions and the other answers, both labeled in Chinese. A shelf beneath the slots holds a stack of blank paper and a cup full of pens. Intrigued, the visitors grab paper and pen and jot down a question in Chinese characters. They slip the sheet into the question slot. After a short wait, another piece of paper slides from the answers slot into a tray. To their delight, they find written on it a perfectly phrased reply in Chinese. They repeat the cycle for some time, receiving witty, informative, and accurate answers, each in flawless Chinese. Eventually, most of the group wanders off to other attractions. One, however, stays behind, keen to meet the presumed Chinese speaker inside the kiosk. She knocks on the door but gets no response. She tries the handle. It's locked. So she sits on a bench across the street and waits. Hours later, the door opens and out steps John Searle. The visitor, who's never heard of Searle, is surprised that he does not appear to be a native Chinese speaker. She hurries over and greets Searle in Chinese. Searle looks puzzled and replies, "I'm sorry, I don't understand a word you're saying." Pushing past Searle, the visitor slips through the still open door. Inside, she finds shelves lined with books, some with English instructions, others filled with Chinese symbols, along with ample paper and pens. And that's all. There's no Chinese speaker present, only Searle, who knows not a single word of Chinese. Well, how then were those Chinese answers produced? Searle himself had no idea he was producing answers of any sort. To him, the questions were merely squiggles, meaningless shapes on paper. He regarded the 2 slots simply as the left and right slots, sheets with squiggles entered on the left, and he had no clue as to why. He couldn't even read the sign above the door. Paid by the hour, he took each sheet, located the squiggles in his books, and followed the prescribed steps. Those books furnished explicit rules, an algorithm for him to execute. Applying the algorithm to the input squiggles yielded another set of squiggles, which he dutifully copied onto fresh paper and pushed out through the right slot. This Chinese room, with its books, paper, pens, and Searle, is meant to mirror a computer running a program. Indeed, Searle himself functions as the computer, for he alone executes the program's steps. From this scenario, Searle concludes that an AI possessing only inputs, outputs, and an algorithm lacks genuine understanding, just as he comprehended nothing of the Chinese sentences that he generated. Although Searle would not claim the Chinese room scenario is his argument, he treats it as a vivid illustration that makes the underlying point less abstract. So, what then is the real crux of the argument? It turns on the distinction between syntax and semantics. Semantics refers to the meaning of symbols and words, whereas syntax covers the rules that govern the well-formed arrangement of symbols into phrases, clauses, and sentences. That difference exists in every language. To illustrate it, American linguist Noam Chomsky offered a now classic example. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. That's in his 1957 book, Syntactic Structures. Grammatically, the sentence is impeccable, yet it's utter nonsense. In terms of syntax, it earns an A+, but in terms of semantics, it receives an F. The opposite pattern can occur as well. Consider the sentence, "All cats is animals." It's obviously meaningful and true, yet it's grammatically incorrect. Here, the singular verb is mismatches the plural subject cats, so the plural form of to be, namely are, is required. Or picture someone fed up with being told he can't do things, who exclaims in frustration, "Ain't nobody gonna tell me I can't do nothing no more." That line's taken from the old TV show Psych, by the way. The speaker's intended meaning is clear. From now on, I won't let anyone tell me I can't do something I want to do. The utterance is perfectly meaningful, yet it's riddled with syntactic errors, grammatical mistakes. Not only natural languages such as English and Chinese, but also formal languages such as mathematics and various programming languages and systems of formal logic exhibit this difference between syntax and semantics. The mathematical statement 2 plus 3 equals 7 is syntactically correct. It's completely false, but that's a problem with meaning, with what it's saying, not with how it's saying it. On the other hand, left parenthesis 3 plus right parenthesis minus 5 equals 19 is guilty of a syntax error. The plus sign is a binary operator. It requires two operands, whereas in this expression, the second operand of the plus sign is missing. It hasn't made an incorrect statement. In a sense, it hasn't even succeeded in making a statement, since the rules of arithmetic syntax dictate that the plus symbol must not only be preceded by a certain type of symbol or set of symbols, but must also be followed by a certain type of symbol or set of symbols, namely either by a number or by an expression, and that's missing in this case. By contrast, we might say that the previous example, 2 plus 3 equals 7, makes an incorrect statement correctly. That is, it makes a false statement in a way that conforms to the rules of mathematical grammar. Another concept fundamental to Searle's thinking that helps to clarify what he means by semantics is the notion of intentionality. Here, intentionality names the capacity of cognitive powers and of their states and dispositions to be about or to represent things, their properties, and entire states of affairs. In short, intentionality is the aboutness of our perceptions, concepts, beliefs, opinions, understandings, and the like. You never have an opinion that's simply an opinion all by itself and that's all. It's always an opinion about something, depicting the world as being a certain way. Likewise, you never have a bare perception that floats free of any object. Each perception is of a thing or of a property of a thing. Late 19th century German philosopher Franz Brentano re-emphasized intentionality, and some later thinkers argued that such aboutness cannot spring from mere physical causes. One such line of reasoning can be formulated as follows. Premise 1. Physical entities can possess only a derived intentionality, never intentionality that's original, independent, or intrinsic. Premise 2. Minds and mental states do possess intentionality that's original, independent, and intrinsic. Therefore, minds and mental states are not physical entities. Is it true, as premise 1 asserts, that no physical entity can possess any but a derived intentionality? Many instances are uncontroversial. For instance, English or Chinese marks on paper have meaning only because speakers assign those marks to express their antecedent thoughts, which already carry an original intentionality. Premise 2 is widely endorsed by defenders of this type of argument and makes good sense. Our most basic thoughts seem to target their objects directly, without needing prior intentional states to confer that aboutness. The spoken or written word cat has no meaning purely as a sound or string of letters. It becomes meaningful only because users collectively employ it to stand for the idea of a cat. By contrast, the idea of a cat itself appears straight away to represent a cat. It just of itself refers to, represents, is about a cat, period, without depending on something prior to it also being about a cat. More controversial is the question whether premise 1 is true universally, as it's stated, and as the argument requires it to be. The claim is that no physical thing can host original intentionality. Searle himself explicitly rejects that notion. He maintains that all intentionality of the primary sort is produced by and supervenes upon biological processes in a functioning brain. Aquinas and Aristotle, incidentally, held an intermediate position. They held that some of our originally intentional states, such as sensory images and memories, belong to bodily organs, whereas our abstract concepts do not belong to any bodily part. At any rate, Searle does hold that original intentionality is a property of our cognitive states, so that factors into his understanding of semantics or meaning. Our concepts, opinions, percepts, and so on are about things. They refer to something or other beyond themselves, and they do this of themselves, by their nature, not just by some human convention about what something should mean. Now that we've acquainted ourselves with the notions of syntax and semantics, we can assemble the argument of Searle that his Chinese room is meant to illustrate. Premise 1. Digital computers and the programs they run merely manipulate symbols according to syntactic rules without regard to meaning. Premise 2. Mere manipulation of symbols according to syntactic rules is not sufficient for thinking or understanding, since it's devoid of meaning. It lacks semantics. Therefore, a computer running a program, no matter how sophisticated, cannot, by virtue of the program alone, be said to genuinely think or understand. This argument has attracted numerous critics as well as supporters. Let's briefly consider some of the criticisms. One famous criticism of Searle's argument is called the systems reply. This criticism concedes that Searle himself does not understand any Chinese while he's carrying out the Chinese conversational algorithm, but asks why we cannot say that the entire system, not just Searle, but also his books, paper, and pens, understands Chinese, since it's this whole system, not just Searle alone, that's producing the answers in Chinese. On this view, the Chinese room does exhibit an understanding of Chinese, not in Searle as an isolated part, but in the room as a whole, as an emergent feature of its operation. That reply may seem strange, but if we're willing to take seriously the question whether an AI system can really think and understand, then we cannot simply dismiss the question whether something like the Chinese room might do so. One way to respond to this objection is to imagine that Searle has memorized the rule books, and that the rules instruct him not on what characters to write, but on what vocal sounds to make and in what order. In that case, we can dispense with the rule books, the paper, the pens. The entire system is now just Searle himself, and yet he still does not understand any Chinese, because all he's doing is following the steps of an algorithm. Another criticism maintains that over time, Searle would begin to learn Chinese simply by implementing the algorithm, eventually coming to understand it. But that's hardly an objection at all, since it introduces a process of learning that goes beyond the mere execution of the algorithm. In that case, if understanding arises, it's not because syntactic manipulation alone is sufficient, but because of additional cognitive processes not accounted for by the algorithm itself. Such a critic is no longer defending the sufficiency of syntax for semantics, but is tacitly admitting the need for something more. A third criticism suggests that while Searle is running the Chinese algorithm, some part of his brain might actually come to understand Chinese, just not the part of which he is consciously aware. But this seems to miss the point of Searle's argument. His Chinese room thought experiment is not presented as a formal proof that syntax cannot produce semantics or intentionality, but as a way of illustrating that point. The critics here appear to be holding out hope that the Chinese algorithm, which is purely syntactic, might nevertheless suffice to generate understanding, even if Searle is not aware of it. But that can be true only if syntax is either identical with semantics or is at least sufficient in principle to produce it. Yet this seems clearly false. Syntax and semantics are certainly not the same. If they were, then it would be impossible for two syntactically different sentences to express the same meaning or truth. But this happens all the time. For example, every square described on a right triangle's hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares described on its legs. And again, if on the hypotenuse of a right triangle a square is described, and squares are also described on its legs, then the one on the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the other two. These two sentences differ syntactically, yet they express the very same truth. Conversely, identical syntax can accompany different meanings. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. The slow yellow snail crawls across the shady lawn. The grammar is the same, but the meanings are not. These same examples show that a determinate syntactic structure is insufficient to produce definite meaning. It's even possible for an entire system of syntactically well-formed statements to be interpreted in radically different ways. For example, the same formal logical system can describe either Poincaré's disk model, which considered in itself is just a part of Euclidean geometry, or it can describe Lobachevsky's hyperbolic geometry. The formal system does not by itself determine which world it's describing. We can assign either interpretation to it. So syntax alone does not determine the semantics. For these reasons, it should be clear that syntax is insufficient for semantics or intentionality. So the hope that some unconscious part of Searle's brain understands Chinese simply because he follows the rules of the Chinese algorithm is misplaced. Besides, if obedience to rules of syntax were a sufficient cause of meaning, why would its power to generate meaning be limited to doing so in a part of the brain that operates unconsciously? Searle is presumably capable of learning Chinese, so why can't his carrying out of the algorithm also cause him to understand the meaning of the symbols he's stringing together? It seems to be because mere symbol manipulation, according to rules, is inadequate to produce meaning and understanding. Rather, it's a feature we impose by way of interpretation. Just as a rock is not a doorstop in itself, but becomes one in light of our purposes. Accordingly, Searle would reject the claim that the brain literally performs unconscious computations. Instead, he would say that we can describe some brain activity as if it were computational, for certain explanatory purposes, but that does not mean the brain is genuinely computing in the way a digital computer does when it's carrying out our deliberate intentions, nor that it's reasoning in any meaningful sense. So while it may be useful for neuroscientists to model neural processes computationally, Searle would argue that the brain's causal powers are biological, not computational, and that only systems with intrinsic intentionality, like conscious minds, can meaningfully be said to engage in understanding or reasoning. This is part of the broader view that we'll be considering in the next argument against the claim that AI can think. Still, other critics have pressed a different kind of objection. They grant that following syntactic rules in manipulating symbols does not generally yield meaningful or intentional states, but they argue that this does not rule out the possibility that some specific kinds of syntactic operations, say certain highly structured algorithms, might, under the right conditions, give rise to genuine representations, ideas, or concepts. In other words, although symbol manipulation as such is not sufficient for meaning, it may be that some particular systems of manipulation do produce meaningful contents as an emergent result of their complexity or organization. Analogously, heat is not sufficient in general to boil water just because it's heat, but heat at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level, which is just a special instance of heat, is sufficient to produce that effect. Daniel Dennett has defended something like this view, suggesting that if a system's behavior is sufficiently rational, coherent, and sensitive to context or responsive to environment, then it's legitimate to treat the system as a bearer of beliefs and meanings, whether or not it feels like anything from the inside. So, regardless of whether the system has any conscious experience of any sort. On that showing, semantics is not identical with syntax, but can emerge from it in the right set of conditions. Accordingly, premise 1 of the Chinese room argument, as we laid it out, digital computers merely manipulate symbols according to syntactic rules without regard to meaning, would not be quite right. If the structure of the manipulation matters and it's appropriately responsive to the system's environment, then some kinds of symbol manipulation may count as idea generation after all. What seems at first like just formal processing may in some cases also be the generation of meaningful thought. Searle would likely reply by denying that such systems have intrinsic intentionality at all. In themselves, they would be devoid of meaning, of semantics, hence of real thinking. Even if a system's outputs appear meaningful to us, it is we who interpret them that way. Like a pattern of dots on paper that becomes a face only in the eye of the beholder, any supposed meaning in the system is observer relative. In Searle's view, computation is always just syntax, and meaning requires a mind, one with the right kind of biological causal powers. No matter how sophisticated a program gets, it remains at bottom a mechanism blindly shuffling symbols without understanding. Before turning to the next argument, I'd like to offer my own brief evaluation of Searle's Chinese room argument. It possesses several notable strengths. First, the argument is admirably general. It does not depend on features unique to particular AI systems, but targets a shared characteristic of all digital computers, namely that they manipulate symbols or transition between symbolic states according to formal rules encoded in their architecture or software. Another strength lies in the foundational distinction it draws between syntax and semantics, a distinction that's both legitimate in itself and widely recognized. Even Dennett, Fodor, Putnam, and Chalmers would agree that syntax is not the same as semantics. A further merit of the argument is that its second premise seems to be either simply true or else in need of a qualification that won't much affect Searle's reasoning. If mere syntactic rule following is never sufficient in itself to generate any sort of meaning or intentionality, then the premise is simply true. Dennett and others propose that sometimes blind syntactic rule following can suffice to produce unconscious meaning. While Searle might dismiss the notion of unconscious meaning as meaningless, an Aristotelian or a Thomistic philosopher might have to pause a little longer on that. According to Aristotle, nature always acts purposefully, with an intrinsic tendency to what's somehow in accord with itself. So even our digestive systems act with purpose in some sense, even if not consciously, and what they do is somehow inherently ordered to some beneficial result. Take another example. Aristotle would say the eye is truly, and not just in our own point of view, for seeing, intrinsically ordered to that act. If he were alive today, he would no doubt see meaning of some sort in our DNA, not something inherently meaningless to which we human beings choose to ascribe meaning. So the notion that something is unconscious, yet has meaning and purpose in some sense, is not really foreign to an Aristotle or an Aquinas. However, even if these thinkers are right about that, it remains that the type of meaning we're concerned with is the one involved in cognitive acts, by which Aristotle, Aquinas, and no doubt Searle would mean conscious meaning. Both according to these thinkers, and I would say in truth, all genuine cognitive acts are conscious acts. They're acts by which we are conscious of something, however imperfectly, and often they're also acts of which we are conscious, or can be, though that's less necessary. This awareness or consciousness of something is what cognition means. Even if Dennett were right that unconscious acts of the brain, and by the same token unconscious acts of an AI system, could carry meaning in the same sense of that word, Searle's argument would remain standing. Such acts do not constitute true cognitive acts since they're devoid of the sort of meaning that cognition requires. If consciousness is removed from the picture, we can keep calling what remains cognition if we like, but it's no longer what we were asking about. We were asking whether AI systems can think and understand in the sense that we do when we perform certain conscious acts. Moreover, while Aristotle might agree with Dennett that the unconscious acts of the brain are in some sense inherently meaningful, he would probably side with Searle in regard to the unconscious acts of our artifacts. Those have meaning only in reference to our deliberate purposes and interpretations. Thus, Searle's argument helpfully draws attention back to conscious intentionality, that essential feature of our cognitive lives by which our thoughts are about or directed toward things, which seems central to any adequate account of the mind. Does the argument exhibit any weaknesses or defects? Perhaps not, but it does seem to have certain limitations. For instance, its applicability may be restricted to digital computational systems. It's not obvious that it extends equally to analog devices or non-symbolic forms of information processing. It also seems to suggest, rightly or not, that genuine cognition in physical systems depends in some essential way on biology, yet without elucidating the causal basis of that dependence. That omission need not count as a flaw in the argument itself, but it does mean the argument stops short of offering a complete explanatory framework, though Searle himself may offer further elaboration elsewhere. Moreover, the argument may not clearly extend to all conceivable forms of AI, for instance, to embodied cognition models, which integrate sensory-motor interaction with the environment in ways that potentially transcend purely symbolic manipulation. Still, the Chinese room argument does succeed in demonstrating something important, that no system operating purely on the basis of syntactic rules thereby possesses genuine cognitive capacities. That conclusion significantly advances our inquiry into the possibility of a true artificial intelligence, even if it does not settle every possible case. The final argument we'll consider in this video is also due to Searle. Or, if he would not endorse it exactly as I will present it, then it's at least inspired by his insights. It can be distilled from the following excerpt taken from his rebuttal to some of his critics. One of the virtues of the commentaries is that they make clear the extreme character of the strong AI thesis. The thesis implies that of all known types of specifically biological processes, from mitosis and meiosis to photosynthesis, digestion, lactation, and the secretion of auxin, one and only one type is completely independent of the biochemistry of its origins, and that one is cognition. The reason they suppose it's independent is that cognition consists entirely of computational processes, and since those processes are purely formal, any substance whatever that's capable of instantiating the formalism is capable of cognition. Brains just happen to be one of the indefinite number of different types of computer capable of cognition, but computers made of water pipe, toilet paper, and stones, electric wires, anything solid and enduring enough to carry the right program, will necessarily have thoughts, feelings, and the rest of the forms of intentionality, because that's all that intentionality consists in, instantiating the right programs. The point of strong AI is not that if we built a computer big enough or complex enough to carry the actual programs that brains presumably instantiate, then we would get intentionality as a byproduct, contra dennit, but rather that there isn't anything to intentionality other than instantiating the right program. Now, I find the thesis of strong AI incredible in every sense of the word, but it's not enough to find a thesis incredible. One has to have an argument, and I offer an argument that's very simple. Instantiating a program could not be constitutive of intentionality because it would be possible for an agent to instantiate the program and still not have the right kind of intentionality. That's the point of the Chinese room example. From these remarks, one might construct an argument along the following lines. Premise 1. Unless there's an excellent reason to think cognition is unlike all other specifically biological processes, it's most reasonable to suppose that it too depends on biochemistry. Premise 2. The reason offered by proponents of strong AI, namely that cognition consists in implementing a formal program, is not only unconvincing, but demonstrably false, as shown by the Chinese room thought experiment. Therefore, nothing advanced by proponents of strong AI displaces the presumption that cognition is biochemically grounded. An immediate consequence of this conclusion is that, on the most reasonable account of cognition, it's a mistake to suppose that an LLM, or any AI operating on a digital computer, possesses a genuine capacity for thought or understanding. From this follows a kind of corollary to the Chinese room argument. The Chinese room was intended to show that purely syntactic operations do not suffice for semantics. But if AI systems do not think or understand, then it follows further that they're not even truly engaged in syntax. Syntax, after all, concerns the arrangement of symbols according to rules, but symbols, as such, do not exist in a system viewed in isolation from intentional agents. Therefore, neither syntactic information, nor syntactic operation, nor computation, properly speaking, exists within the machine itself. This becomes clearer if we distinguish between two types of terms: those that name things as they are in themselves, independently of our intentions, and those that name things as they are for us, in light of our plans or purposes. Square, for example, names a geometrical figure defined by properties it has in itself, 4 equal sides meeting at right angles. Whether anyone sees it, thinks of it, or intends anything by it, likes it or not, it remains what it is. But a paperweight is different. It's a functional designation. A stone can be ideal for use as a paperweight, but it's not a paperweight merely by existing in nature. It becomes one only when taken up for that purpose by somebody. Searle's view is that a symbol is like a paperweight in this sense. Nothing is a symbol simply in virtue of its physical properties. Black ink on paper is just that, black ink in a pattern. It becomes a symbol only when someone assigns meaning to that pattern. In this way, symbols are observer relative. They exist only in relation to minds that confer significance on them. Thus, where no agent assigns or understands symbolic meaning, there are no symbols. And where there are no symbols, there can be no genuine symbol manipulation, no syntax, and therefore no computation. From this, we can draw a further argument. Premise 1. Every mind is capable of using symbols. Premise 2. No AI system is capable of using symbols, since it lacks cognition and so is not a purposive agent. Therefore, no AI system is a mind. According to this reasoning, the symbolic structures found within an AI system are not intrinsic to the system itself, but exist only relative to us, our purposes, our interpretations. Here again, we may wonder whether it's quite right to say that symbols are truly symbols only ever in human regard. Are codons not natural symbols of amino acids in some sense, and independently of what we happen to think about them? Even if this second argument, which Searle himself might or might not accept in precisely this form, is sound, it still leaves open further questions that may be accessible to philosophical inquiry. One such question is whether there's any good reason, aside from what proponents of strong AI have said, to suppose that cognition might ever be independent of biochemistry. Aquinas, as I've noted previously, thought the answer is yes. Namely in the case of intellects capable of understanding universal truths, such as the human intellect. Both he and Aristotle held that all acts of sensory cognition, which includes much of what we today consider reasoning, are carried out in the body, and thus, we may now add, such acts are essentially dependent on biochemistry. But they made an exception for intellectual cognition, and they had reasons for doing so which I won't address here. Another question is whether broader differences between AI systems and living beings might help explain why brains are capable of cognition while machines are not. In upcoming videos 8 and 9, I hope to explore that question further with help from Aquinas. Well, that's it for this video. In the next one, we'll take a look at another type of argument against the position that AI can truly think and understand, based not on the thought of Aquinas, not on the thought of John Searle, but on the ingenious work of Kurt Gödel. See you there.